So we've had a long day, some really intense, meaty, occasionally feisty conversations in the breakouts, and this is going to be the opportunity to report back. But before we do that, I just want to repeat something that I said this morning. This gathering is really intended to provoke action. You are very busy people. The last thing you need in your lives is another gab fest. You don't need networking opportunities. I suspect all of you have more networking opportunities than you could ever hope for. So what we really hope to do with today's sessions is to give you ideas for action and perhaps spark some follow-up for collective action. I was really encouraged to hear Mark Lautenbach and Julie Sweet earlier today talk about a session, an effort that the Business Roundtable has undertaken on credentialing for training programs that came out of the conversation that we had at the Vatican last December. And it was great to hear the follow-up from Raj. Are you still here, Raj? I'm sorry. Oh, there you are right there. I got lights in my face. Sorry. And Joe Jimenez from Novartis, the work that's been made on the healthcare workers. We really hope that the report backs and the proposals you're going to hear from these working groups will spark ideas, will spark coalitions, efforts to turn what we've been talking about today into real action. Now, here's the bad news for the co-chairs. You each have 2 minutes to sum up that hour-and-a-half conversation that you had in breakout groups. So we need you to be very pithy. There are editors around the room if you'd like to grab one and get them to. Cliff has edited me many, many times. He can take 1,000 words and turn it into 200 without thinking twice. So I would urge you to take advantage of that resource. We're going to start with the Workforce Development, Training, and Education Task Force and the co-chairs. First of all, Deanna Mulligan, please. Can we get a microphone?
Well, our group had a tremendous task. I think given the diversity of companies and expertise and people in the room, we had everybody from startups to huge 150-year-old plus companies. So we needed an editor. But we came up with 3 points. I'm going to talk about the first one, which is the need to think differently on training, retaining, and supporting workers. And if you think about training, it can take everything from interns, people coming into the company, the kind of training and support that young people need today in order to develop work skills and be able to come to work for us. We talked a lot about that. We also talked a lot about retraining, a huge topic given everything we're talking about with AI and machine learning. And then we talked about the nature of education, which some of my colleagues will expand on. But a couple of key points. First of all, training needs to be part of your infrastructure budget. It needs to be a cost, a line item that's significant because it builds human capital. And we talked about this a little bit this morning in our opening statement. We need to get more feedback from the people who are coming to work for us, who are working for us, and even feedback from the people who are leaving the workforce. We talked about ways to get down to the front line, get continuous feedback, and turn that into continuous kind of on-the-spot training. Training has changed a lot over the last many years, and it's in a really dynamic spot right now. And so we all need to kind of hop on to that bandwagon if we're not there already. Then we talked about training on the way out, specifically the fact that some people won't adjust to things that we need to do, and some people's jobs, let's face it, will be replaced by technology. What do we do with those people? As responsible citizens, can we find a way to retrain them to go on to another career somewhere else? And if we all agreed to do that, we could solve a big looming problem. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleagues to talk about expanding hiring and recruiting and what policies and incentives we should put in place for that.
Dan Rosenzweig of CHEG, thank you. It's a fascinating discussion because of, as you mentioned, the diversity. So the first thing we want to talk about is this section is about the future workforce. So a lot has been talked about your existing workforce, but just so you know, the average age of a college graduate, if they're graduating at all, is 26 years old. 70% of them go to a state school. 40% of them work 30 hours or more while they're in school full-time on both sides. That by 2021, 25% of the US population, English will be their second language. They may be proficient in it, but second language nonetheless. And so diversity and inclusion is coming whether you like it or not, and it should be coming, and we need to acknowledge that. And one of the ways to do that is to fundamentally reimagine your workforce. Not what you think it should be or think that it was, but think about what it can be. And when you think about what it can be, you have to change infrastructure and structural impediments to it, which is how do you hire, how do you write the job description, what does a job description look like in the future, recognizing that nobody is going to be matching what the jobs used to be, and then figuring out the necessary support mechanisms to support a diverse group of people when they come in. So let me just give you a statistic from college. When the colleges were trying to get full payers and inclusion, they went to China and had a substantial percentage of students that came in from China. Unfortunately, 25% of them failed out because there was no support systems for them. So if you think about what you need to do, it's reimagine your workforce, reimagine the job description, reimagine the definition of success. What do you need to do to not only recruit them, but to make them comfortable, to support them, to constantly train them, and to build an environment in which they can do their best work? And that requires the CEO to not only believe in it, but to do it and to change a bunch of policies that support it and a bunch of incentives that allow for people to make different decisions. And so one single example that was cited is most people, the recruiter's job is to hire the most qualified person as quickly as they can, which is counter to inclusion and diversity because the pipelines are different. So you need to think about what is the recruiter role, the hiring manager role, and the CEO needs to be verbal about it, talk about it, support it, and reward it. So those were some of the things that we talked about.
Thank you, Dan. Suzanne?
Sure, thanks. You covered a lot, most of it. I'll just highlight two additional things. And Alan, you talked about it, which is a follow-up from the Business Roundtable initiative, creating standardizations on credentialing that I think a lot of us in this room could get behind as it relates to competency and not pedigree. Julie, is that called the credentialing engine? Yeah. So I think check that out. Make sure that your head of human resources and hiring managers begin to get familiar with that. And we're looking for more people to kind of join that effort. And then the second thing I'll just call out, maybe 1.5, is consider joining the 1% pledge. There's 3,000 companies that are part of that. Many of them in this room. It sort of calls out your brand as a socially conscious business. Just legitimizing what you're already doing, and we're kind of adding to that, holding out sort of at least 1% to 2% of your workforce for non-traditional candidates.
Suzanne, I'm going to give you an extra minute because I want you to elaborate just a little bit on this point of competency, not pedigree. I think that was an important part of the conversation. Want to make sure everybody understands your point.
Yeah, it goes back to a little bit to what Dan was saying, and I forget some of the statistics, but if you something, I'll probably get this wrong, but 70% of young adults don't go to college. So if you and your company say college degrees are required for all jobs, including entry-level jobs, you're inherently leaving out 70% of the population just right off the bat. Those numbers are much higher as it relates to certain minority groups as well. So really rethinking your job description and particularly your recruiting practices and retraining of hiring managers to really look at competency over credentialing, over pedigree.
Pedigree. And the other important point that was made in the session was it really has to come from the CEO.
That's right.
It's the CEO who has to communicate to the HR department, I'm okay with this change.
Yeah, and we're going
to take risks and let people fail if they make a mistake hiring one person that didn't fit. It's okay.
Yeah, and maybe just on that last point that I'll just say is one thing we had talked about was making transparent your hiring plans internal to your company. You can get all of this information on third-party systems anyway. Might as well get out in front of your own employees to say, this is where we're going to be hiring next year. These are the skills we needed. These are how to get these skills.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Round of applause for the Workforce Development Training and Education Group. Next up is investing in women, starting with Rick Goins.
Thanks, Alan. Elise Nelson, our expert, started it off by really talking about there has been progress. There's building support and even laws, but I think you made a very important point. If the laws that were on the books they were really enforced, we could make a lot more progress. And so our simple net takeaway was that it really looks to us in companies. I think Richard Edelman, with his trust barometer, came out very clearly that there's a lack of trust in most of our institutions, and therefore you've got to start looking to business to do it. I'll cover the first point, and then Julie will cover the other 2 points. Number one was on investing in women. We think, number one, we've got to build the women's leadership ranks out there. And there was a long conversation about all the different things we can do for that. But I really do believe that it starts out with something they do at Salesforce. Mark obviously has a rule there. If you walk into a meeting and you don't have 30% diversity in the meeting, don't hold the meeting. You really start putting these things in place. It's a change in the mindset that this isn't social justice, it's the business case for women in the workplace. We have now 6% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are women. The next point we talked about, and I brought up very clearly, we created at the United Nations he for she, because unless you get guys who are really, where they're heads of state, heads of corporations, heads of institutions, and NGOs, you're not going to get more women into the pipeline, which leads next to you got to have sponsorship and mentorship going along. We talk about better onboarding as we go forward. Really interesting, the Bain study once showed that similar people coming in, men and women, have about the same attitude for success with regard to making it to the C-suite, but within 2 years, she drops by almost 50% because she didn't get that sponsorship. She didn't get that mentorship. Anyway, the list went on, and I'm sure I poorly represented it, was biased by my own views on this, and that I won't apologize for.
Julie?
First of all, if you're interested in the credential engine, on October 2nd, the BRT is actually hosting a call, and we can get information out to you, so just let us know, because we'd love to have a lot of companies join that.
Julie, if you get that to us, we'll make sure that everybody here has access to it.
Great, that'd be terrific. So we had 2 additional points. The first is around a commitment to actually putting in place at each of our companies the processes that will ensure equal pay for equal jobs. And you'll notice I didn't say a commitment to equal pay. The real nuance here is the commitment to actually put in the processes. We did this a few years ago. I will tell you that we did not think we were not paying equally. When you talk to the external law firms and other credentials, they say every company's the same. You know, no one thinks they're paying, no one wants to pay not unequally, and everyone thinks they are paying equally until they do the data. And so what we talked about is that if you're investing in women, it is table stakes that we all make sure that we are in fact have equal pay for equal jobs. So that was first. Second, we talked about an important commitment that we all need to make with respect to transparency and measurable goals. As we went around the room, there was a theme of CEOs who have set clear goals. They're public to their team. In some cases, they're public to the entire company. Greg Becker at Silicon Valley Bank talked about how he's made 5-year goals and speaks to them, to the entire company every quarter. And so the idea of transparent and measurable goals as a way to accelerate change and also to be more bold, because it is hard to do new and innovative things if people don't understand what the issues are and the journey. And then third, I'm going to add a plug for the CEO Action Initiative for Diversity and Inclusion. Many of the CEOs in this room have joined it. There's over 300 CEOs. Alan was great in publicizing it. This is a commitment to doing unconscious bias training, which was one of the things that came up in our session, to creating an atmosphere for inclusion and diversity, and most importantly, for sharing best practices. There's a website open to all companies who sign up. Many of the founders are in this room. I see EY, we've got Deloitte, P&G. 300 CEOs have already signed up, and I will tell you that this conference reminds us of how important it is to be sharing best practices so that we can learn from each other and accelerate. So if you're interested in that, we'll get, Alan will have the information as to how you can join and access more of the best practices that we discussed in today's session.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Round of applause for investing in women. There's a work group on deploying technology to create jobs, not destroy them. And we'll start with Joe Kaeser from Siemens. Thank you, Joe, for being here and for your support.
Yeah, thank you, Alan.
There comes.
Well, actually, there have been a bunch of topics we've been trying to solve. It went all the way from saving the planet to come back to what it actually means. The first topic, what we said, needs to be clear. We need to be sure that technology is not going to be the purpose. That's being understood as the enabler to create something better as a purpose. And we talk a lot about the future of artificial intelligence. We talk about robotics. We talk about advanced manufacturing, all that stuff. It scares the hell out of people. So we need to talk more about what is it that we can do. For example, you know, with technology, we can defeat cancer. We can stop terrorism. That type of stuff we need to create to people so that they know this is actually good for them. So we need to explain the benefit of technology. You also need to find, and that's very important because there will be jobs lost, we need to find new applications. And need to be sure, you know, how we can do it. Werner von Siemens 170 years ago, he was inventing electricity, technology. But then no one needed it because there was no machines to consume electricity. And so we need, and then he invented, obviously, you know, the applications for that. And that's what we also need to do, invent the applications so that we are able to create jobs like the telecoms did when they had nowhere to go. And they said, then let's do data traffic, you know, transport photos and pictures and make a business out of it. Second topic, and that's also important, big companies should not throw a lot of money into startups and make someone else rich. Big companies ought to create an environment where startups can actually prosper in the company environment. So that we don't provide money, which is cheap, but we provide excellence, go-to-market, technology, IPR, so whatever a startup needs in that environment. And with that, we can create growth, we can create applications, and then first and foremost, we can create jobs. With that, I would hand it over to Tiger to get the rest of the group.
Yeah, so Tiger Tyagarajan, who runs Genpact, which is our knowledge partner. And Tiger, thank you for being our partner in this effort and for all the help you've provided in framing this.
Thank you, Alan. Just to add to what Joe said, and this will be a little of an overlap with the other group that talked about training. The team spent a lot of time focused on, as technology comes in and as it changes the nature of work completely, two things are going to happen. A bunch of roles and tasks that get done today by human beings is going to go away. And those people who are doing those tasks need to be retrained. The responsibility of that retraining must be taken on by corporations. We can't, I mean, the group debated, should we actually have a tax that comes in for driverless cars that then some government takes on the role? And the conclusion was, why would we do that? Because that just adds more bureaucracy, and who knows how it's going to work. So the conclusion was, really the responsibility of doing this should be by corporation, maybe groups of companies within industries that get impacted or are actually driving the change and the benefit of some of these technologies coming in. The other discussion was, don't do it alone. Come together as ecosystems, communities, and the ecosystem is companies that are driving this, communities, colleges, universities in that ecosystem that actually should be part of that, and make those people retrain not just for jobs that you can provide them, but actually employability into other jobs. Yeah. And that pivots on to a more optimistic view that I think basically the whole room had, which is all of this technology, while clearly there's going to be disruption, clearly there's going to be the nature of work that changes. The reality is that if you push the clock and the horizon a little longer, it'll actually create more than destroy in the aggregate. The unfortunate thing is we're going to go through a period of transition. And the last point I think Mark brought up is the nature of work itself is changing, the nature of employment is changing, gig economy. And therefore, should we as larger companies find a way to actually work with the self-employed, work with the entrepreneurs, and include that in our broader company ecosystem, because that's going to be the nature of work.
It's interesting, Tiger, that the point about training to help people for their next job, which also came up in the training group. That's a pretty profound change in how you think about your employees, and it's interesting that came up in two different groups today. The next session is Harnessing the Digital Health Revolution to Help Billions. And if I'm reading this right, Bernard, you chased away all your co-chairs, and so you're left to do it all by yourself. The microphone is yours. I'll let you have a little extra time.
Mark is unfair, but he actually came up with a great answer. So just right quick, our work was to look at the digital health revolution to help billions. We started obviously looking at this mega problem and really broke it down, if you recall the themes from this morning, where Mark mentioned about the zip code being a bigger determinant of your health outcomes than actually now your DNA codes, et cetera. And then Raj gave some great examples of the use of technology to take health care out. And so we started talking about if we wanted to move out of the, quote, healthcare lane, where would we go? And there are a couple of things that everyone can do that will add healthy life years to anyone. Eating right, sleeping right, and exercising right. And then we started to talk about many of our communities are deprived of the infrastructure that are needed to make that happen. And so, long story short, we then started to bridge into how can we contribute to make a difference using technologies and some of our common skills and capabilities. And one of the things that we started to focus on is the whole notion about community health workers. And this is a connection of people who will look out for the best interest of individuals in their communities, and then to build a network around them where they are fully resourced to execute on things that can have an immediate impact. So think about an individual who lives next door to someone in the community who cannot afford food. And if this individual had a way of connecting to a source, to say, my neighbor is out of food, now how do we coordinate to make that happen? And you get organizations like Mark, who has a lot of money since he's not here. He'll pay for Meals on Wheels to start to bring food into that environment. And then this morning someone asked a question and Mark and I were clear, because it is more economical for me to pay for that person getting food than waiting until that person shows up in my emergency department and I pay 10x what I would have paid simply by providing that person with meals on a regular basis. So then I think the last part, we said that we would then look at technology, and that becomes the infrastructure, and there are a lot of options out there. Google, we're starting to use Workplace with Facebook. There are other tools out there that allows you to build virtual communities, infrastructure, that then we connect all the pieces. And the secret here is to keep it very simple. So it can have the kind of positive impact.
Bernard, can you demonstrate the return on investment if Kaiser or Aetna finances Meals on Wheels to get food to ailing people? Will you be able to show that that's having an impact on your cost of care?
Oh, absolutely. You know, over time, the secret is going to be the redesigning of the whole healthcare industry that focuses on health, which means early detection, early diagnosis, early treatment, upstream, and what we call in Kaiser Permanente maximizing the healthy life years, which means you are delaying, postponing, or hopefully reversing embedded chronic illnesses that happens generally in society today because people are living longer. And because people are living longer and we aren't eating right, sleeping right, exercising right, we naturally are recipients of chronic illnesses like diabetes, like heart disease, like kidney failure, etc. And so I can show you now in Kaiser Permanente why we invest so much in upstream, because paying for someone to go or have a nurse or someone to look after someone that might be $100 of cost on a PM basis versus waiting until they show up in the emergency department or in one of our hospital beds, in addition to unnecessary suffering, which is the biggest cost, the second piece is the economics are very different. So we know with this approach, we can produce the economics around it.
Thank you. Energy and environment, a round of applause for Bernard, carrying the burden by himself. And in the energy, environment, and climate change group, Hugh Grant, you also have to carry the burden for all your co-chairs. I'm sure you can do it, though.
Thank you, Alan. So we had a very robust discussion. It was a very diverse group. So we had smart cities, we had energy, we had agriculture. We had the conversation again on how many times you wash your Levi's. So three things that we kind of boiled this down to. The first one is, as believers, so we're talking to a group who are all passionate believers in this, we need to up our game because things have changed in the whole climate discussion since Rome. So our personal advocacy and how we represent the challenges, we need to double down on that. If not us, then who? So that's the first one. The second one is we need to increase the transparency on our actions and goals, and they need to be even more science-based now than they have been in the past. And Chip talked earlier on open sourcing, so how we share resources amongst a diverse group so that each individual company isn't reinventing the wheel. And then the third one is sectors count. So as a small nucleus of believers, and you look at the makeup of this room, we're members of a Fortune 500 or even bigger. And the question is, how do we drive advocacy and enroll others in this conversation? So we all believe in leverage. How do we expand this and bring more people to the party? And Sven Lindblad made a really good point. He talked about noble warriors. And although noble warriors believe passionately in the cause, they probably aren't going to be successful as solo ventures. So the third piece of this, Alan, is how we build the ecosystem and how we bring others into this conversation around climate change.
Yeah, I think that came up in several of the breakout groups. Thank you, Hugh. Round of applause. So we had a session on building platforms for empowering entrepreneurs and small business. Tory Burch was one of the co-chairs, but Tory, I understand you were so impassioned in the conversation that you lost your voice as a result. So your colleague is going to, okay.
I think we're going to start with Catherine.
Start with Penny?
Yeah,
okay.
That's okay.
Penny, thank you. Go right ahead.
No, thank you. We had a robust conversation such that Troy lost her voice again. But she participated very energetically. Anyway, we came up with 3 recommendations as it relates to encouraging entrepreneurship and small business. And the first was the issue of access to capital and the opportunity to use technology and data and information to create new systems to establishing borrowing credibility besides just already being a borrower. And we talked about regulations that could be adopted to reduce bias in lending. The second thing we talked about was improving regional diversity in venture capital and the role that large corporations could play in supporting the venture capital communities in their hometowns. And finally, the opportunity to strengthen CDFIs. And for those of us who haven't used a CDFI or don't know what they are, that's a nonprofit that exists in many of our communities. Some are stronger than others. Those that are strong are really great at helping small businesses get access to capital.
Dan Schulman.
Over to Dan.
Thanks, Penny. After small businesses or entrepreneurs get access to capital, the next thing they need to be successful is capabilities. They have to compete often with larger companies. Getting incremental capital to scale, to invest in platforms is difficult for them. And we all came to the conclusion that for our growth to continue, small business and entrepreneurs have to be successful. And what if we could extend our capabilities to them? What if we could move from being product-oriented companies to being platform companies? Open our platforms and our capabilities through API sets, through different means, so that small businesses can tap into what we can offer them. Often we have millions and millions of customers, of hundreds, maybe thousands of suppliers. Bring them into our ecosystem, bring them into our partnerships, and help them to grow and succeed. Offer them mentorship. We can also provide capital and help them as well, because again, their success is our success. So we had a good, robust conversation around that.
So other than capital and capability, the last thing that we came to was that entrepreneurs need visibility. And not only to attract more customers, but also to influence those financial institutions that may be looking at businesses with the wrong lens. There's plenty of successful entrepreneurs without perfect FICO scores. And this is also where Fortune comes in. We talked about Fortune having a regular profile of entrepreneurs who don't fit the archetypes. Entrepreneurs like Mary Molina, who started a granola bar company in her kitchen and was on food assistance, and now she gives back to food, food banks. Or people like Paris Zabo, who was an oncologist and is now got sick of treating cancer. Now she wants to prevent it with products that don't cause cancer in personal hygiene. There's lots of great stories to tell that aren't Silicon Valley, and I think we'd all love to hear them. And lastly, we talked about do the work. Find women businesses, find businesses that include people of color, and really seek them out to make them your vendors. And then when you have a successful experience, share that with other businesses as well. Recommend people. A lot of people on the margins don't have the same kind of networks, and we have to help them create them.
Great, thank you. Cliff, you in on that? Out-of-the-box entrepreneurs? Good, thanks. Working group on shareholders and boards, long-term mission and focus. Mark, there you are, yes. And you lost your co-chair as well, but you can carry the burden.
Thank you. So yeah, Lady Lynn Rothschild was my co-chair, did a great job, but she had a board meeting, so had to take off. So we started with the premise of everyone is here because of the name of the program, doing well by doing good. And so we were trying to figure out, and everyone in the room was a business leader who said, we want to do well by all our stakeholders, not just our shareholders, and we want to think long term. But we all have trouble doing it. We have trouble doing it. We spent a lot of time talking about activists and how it could take away from attention, how it could drive shorter term thinking. But we said it goes beyond activists. It's a 24-hour news cycle. It's the analysts. It's the quarterly earnings reports. It takes away from really being able to think and make a long-term case for sustainable profitability and growth. So we said, what can we do? What can we work on together to try and change that dynamic and help those business leaders that want to think longer term? And two aspects came up. What can the private sector do by itself, individual companies, and what can we do together? And in the private sector, basically, a few things. One is adopt a purpose and talk about it, and talk about what your company's purpose is beyond making money. and talk about it loudly and talk about it often with all your stakeholders, your boards, to make sure they understand it and they help keep you accountable to it, your employees, your supply chain, your communities, and really emphasize that. And then come up with metrics to hold yourself accountable, maybe on a longer-term basis. Don't just say you're going to have a good purpose and make it a tagline, but actually build it into your longer-term metrics and measure it. Be authentic and have intestinal fortitude. That came up several times because when you have a long-term purpose and your board buys into it and all of a sudden an activist comes in or you miss your earnings and your shares drop, how do you stay on your long-term goals but not? You have to have all those people behind you, so you have to have that fortitude. And then the last thing individually we can do is make sure you have good governance, make sure your board acts independently and thinks about long-term compensation goals, long-term objectives, not just looking over your short-term. And then the second part was what can we do together to improve, to basically help the capital markets work better. And two really specific options here. One, well, they both relate to working to improve upon quarterly earnings, which by its nature, the group believe, forces short-term thinking and attention to short-term goals as opposed to long-termism. So the first was to try and develop alternative financial and non-financial metrics that could be agreed upon that could be an alternative to just historical quarterly earnings. Without that, the only thing you have to actually compare across industries or companies is those short-term historical numbers. So the idea was to get asset owners, asset managers, and corporate leaders, asset creators together to try and see if they could, within industries, come up with some things that they can't agree on, because as much as you may want to do it as the CEO, if your investors take a different tact, you're going to be stuck going in their direction. So that is one long-term project that we're working on together. The second was to consider ending, in the U.S. in this case was, because, well, in Europe, but there's not much in Europe, quarterly forward-looking guidance. Okay? So
you can applaud now. Yep.
Well, yeah. There was many, many, many people in the room who thought that was a good idea for lots of reasons. There was great statistics. Only actually, I didn't really know this myself. 27% of the U.S. companies do it today, so not that high a percentage. And only less than 1% in Europe actually do forward-looking guidance. There's very little evidence of its success. A lot of reasons why they want to do it. There are some in the room who took an alternative view and said, if you don't have that, analysts will jump in. We have nothing that we can point to hold for consistent revenue, and that's a problem. So ties back to my first point, which is that means if you are thinking about doing that, if we're able to do that, you'd have to have your own metrics longer term. Some people talked about it. They do it yearly. They put it in their quarterly reports, and they have metrics that they share broadly to take that place. And that were really the two things under what we can do together. And
yeah,
that was it.
That was great, Mark. Applause, sure, go ahead. I would just say, since I moderated that session, the single word heard most often in that room was balance. It's not short-term versus long-term. It's how do you get a set of metrics and governance in place so that you're focused on both. Nobody is going to, as much as you as a CEO might like it, no investor is going to say to you, go grow your company and come back in 5 years and tell us how it's going, right? I can't remember who to attribute that to, but I thought that was a good point. Last group, company culture, incentives, and productivity. And Stan Bergman from Henry Schein was one of the co-chairs. Stan, you want to start?
Thank you, Alan. And all three of our co-chairs survived. We're all here. So
you should get an award for that alone.
Yeah, for trying. So we concluded clearly that it's about numbers and purpose. You need both. That was a very strong, I think, feeling out of the group, and that both the financial side and the value side, the purpose side, need to be communicated and openly communicated to the team, which included regularly surveying the team and making sure at the same time that all the various stakeholders and the constituents that drive the company's success are all engaged, whether it's suppliers or customers, the team, investors, and of course society, that they'll all be engaged in one way or another in understanding the goals of the company. And of course, one of the areas that we also spoke about, people use different language, was ensuring that all the team in the company are totally engaged with the company's mission, and that one needs to move pretty fast these days in making sure that engagement, people are keeping up with engagement and understanding what's important to the company. So that's generally the concepts. I'll turn over to my co-chairs. And this was not discussed, but I think, Bernard, you need to go to Washington in a hurry and stay there, please, until this is all fixed.
Denise Ramos.
Sure. So as part of the culture, we then spent a lot of time talking about the C-suite and how important the executives in the C-suite are and how they must consistently demonstrate and live their company's values. It really has to be authentic and something that you believe in and something that you really own. So you also have to make a commitment to making sure that you align your action with your talk. That's really vital. So what is the shadow that you cast, and that you cast every single day in every meeting and every interaction that you're having with your employees? And then the other thing is companies with a successful culture honor what they say in good times and in bad. So you have to stick with it. And then the other thing is to make sure that you spend money according to your values, because that's what people see, and that's what really demonstrates to them if you're living your values.
Mark?
And finally, there was a common consensus that practicing empathy should be a core competency in companies. Bernard's story of that nurse reaching out and holding his hand was really a beautiful example of a practice of empathy, even though she didn't speak a word. The idea behind that was you heard about the idea of surveying your employee base. So this practice of empathy is not just with customers, it's with employees and really all your constituents. The importance of this was emphasized. Rich Lesser made the point that we're living in a time of extraordinary change, and the rapidity of that change is accelerating. In fact, one of the remits for this gathering is that government, it says government alone is incapable of solving these intractable problems. I think you may be even able to eliminate the word alone and recognize that the private sector has a huge role to play in this. So even as we are all running quickly to adapt and be agile and pivot, there's some constancy that's really, really important, because if we're going to be a force in solving intractable problems, we need staying power as a sector, that is the private sector. And it adds one other very important dimension, which is it instills confidence and is a good ballast for our people. That is, there's some constancy and some reliability in how we're behaving, and if we're consistent about how we express our purpose and our mission, and we do that through empathy, that can be a great stabilizing force.
Great, thank you. So we've got just a few minutes left. Is there anything glaringly obvious that didn't make the list today? Anything any of you think we're missing? Anything any of you think we need to add to what we've talked about here? Now is your moment to speak up. Nina. Hang on just a second for the microphone.
Sorry. Nina Easton Fortune. So I was the moderator, so I'm being a little forward here. But on the investing in women, one thing that was left out that I thought when we spoke just now that I thought was really important was one way to increase leadership ranks is to onboard women who have stepped out of the workplace to raise children or to do other things and to come back in. And I know Tiger and a couple others had some, called it Career 2.0. There were just a number of programs that came up that are underway, and that they actually improve senior management ranks when you do that.
Yeah, great, thank you. Anything else? Any other comments? Anything we missed? Or are you just all so eager to get to the bar that you're not going to tell me?